Good morning, everybody. I see our participants are slowly adding in. We'll just give it another moment or two. All right, I know everyone's time is incredibly valuable, and we currently have most of the team here. So I want to thank everyone for attending today. This is the Tax Credit Educational Roundtable. My name is Matt Bishop. I'm the founding partner at Sinking Ship Entertainment and co-chair of CASO, along with my lovely sidekick, Pete Enemy. We're really excited to have everyone here together. We're excited to bring Len Pendergast, who's a former board member and working at Global Initiative, Paul Moyer, my very first boss in the industry as well, and CEO at Eggplant Pictures and Sound, and Nick Iannelli from Take 5 Pictures to kind of walk us through. So I will pass it over to Len.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Welcome, everyone. Great, really glad to be here. So I think we want to start. I think the question on the table is what really is happening with OCASE. There's a number of proposals that are out there. The government is looking at making some changes. And I want to start by saying I think the initial question that was presented to the Ontario government, which is where they started this process, is that they heard really clearly from the industry that they did not like the tethering. They did not like OCASE being tethered to OPSTC or OFGTC in the application process, that caused a lot of problems, and that's where they're looking at making changes. So there's a number of things number of proposals they're considering to fix that, but that's really where it started. I think before we really get into that discussion, it's worth talking about what is OCASE exactly and what makes it unique. OCASE is as everyone knows, Ontario Computer Animation Special Effects Tax Credit. It's a visual effects credit. It was the first one introduced for the film industry across in the world. I believe I've never been aware of any other credit, and Ontario really pioneered in this area. It was developed at a time when the industry was very different. The way visual effects and animation were made was very different. It was still primarily 2D animation. Limited amounts of things that could be done with visual effects. You see that in the regulation, the wording in the regulations of legislation talking about green screen. In Quebec still does that because that was primarily the visual effects, the only visual effects that were possible at the time. So just keep that in mind, that the legislation and regulations are very difficult to change, and even though business structures and technologies can change, the legislation and regulations don't keep pace with those changes. And that's one of the problems that's happened with OCASE over the years, is that the industry has changed, the way visual effects are made has changed, and that's not been reflected in OCASE. The second thing that's important to remember about OCASE is that because it was the first visual effects tax credit, other jurisdictions came along after and created a visual effects bonus and wanted to build on and compete with OCASE, and in some cases, I think arguably could be said, created a better bonus, at least with certain objectives in mind in reaching those objectives. But absolutely, BC and Quebec looked at OCASE and created a visual effects bonus that they thought was better, that was a better version of OCASE. And so Ontario then all of a sudden had to compete with those jurisdictions in terms of as a comparison for its OCASE credit. So that's kind of where we're at. As Matt said, I work at Global Incentives. I used to run the tax credit program for the OMDC when it was still called the OMDC. I joined Global Incentives 18 years ago now. We work with producers across the world. I mean, most of our clients are based in Los Angeles, but we work with Canadian producers as well. We advise and manage incentives in Canada, the US, and around the world. About 90% of our business is on Canadian and US incentives, but we do Australia, the UK, Hungary, Croatia, New Zealand, sort of wherever there is a credit, we'll do it. But we do see a lot of productions that are accessing credits in BC, Quebec, Ontario, Georgia, New Mexico, New York. That's the bulk of the work that we do. So we see very clearly how those credits work, what the benefits are for producers, comparisons of timelines, qualification of costs, the bottom line benefits. So we have that perspective. I have that perspective that I hope you can bring to the table today. I think I'll let Nick and Paul introduce themselves and how they use OCASE.
Thanks, Len. I'll jump in. Hello, I'm Paul Moyer. I'm a partner at Eggplant Picture and Sound, formerly Optics Digital Pictures, where we offer visual effects and full post services, primarily for television series, feature films, and movies of the week. I've worked in the post-production and visual effects field since the late 1980s. And when Optics first started in 1996, Ron Essie of Core was our neighbor in our building. And he asked me to join the newly forming board of CASO, where I was first involved in the membership drive committee and was later vice president and the marketing chair. CASO's mission as an industry association was always committed to the growth and international competitiveness of Ontario's animation and visual effects industry. In addition to this, a major goal of forming our association from the start was to create a collective voice with which to lobby the provincial government for tax incentives. And to participate in the credit, certain criteria needed to be met by qualifying corporations regarding qualified labor expenditures, eligible activities, and also eligible project genres. So at the beginning, meeting the requirements were achievable, and the funds received definitely were used to help keep our company competitive in the marketplace. Over to you, Nick.
Hey, thanks, Paul. Good morning, everyone. Nick Iannelli here from Take 5 Productions. I've been involved in post-production and visual effects my entire career, starting out as an online editor, through a compositor, through to eventually running what was Deluxe Toronto at the time, which is now known as Company 3. I joined Take 5 5 years ago, overseeing all post and visual effects. Take 5, we're a full service production company providing services primarily to all the Hollywood studios, the Netflixes, MGMs, CBS studios, Sonys and Foxes of the world. We do a range of productions. We have shows that will shoot in Ontario and take their post-production and some of the visual effects back to LA and the rest of the world. Shows like Star Trek Strange New Worlds, Star Trek Discovery, Lock and Key. Then we have shows that we produce in Toronto that are shot in Toronto, but also all the post-production happens in Ontario. Shows like The Handmaid's Tale, Accused, upcoming Doc, and many others. And then because of our specialty over the years in really developing a post community and helping to develop that post and visual effects community in Ontario, we've been able to attract shows that don't necessarily shoot or don't shoot in Ontario, but shoot in the rest of the world, but bring their post and visual effects to Ontario. Shows like Halo that shoots in Budapest, Wednesday that shot in Romania, Valhalla that shoots in Ireland, From and Billy the Kid and Hotel Cocaine shooting in Dominican Republic, and Moonhaven in Ireland. And so a lot of these shows have extensive visual effects, and so we oversee all of that. And then one of the biggest things we do, though, is help manage the tax credits across all those shows. And when you have a show like a Halo and Wednesday, where there's a lot of visual effects, sometimes the idea is to do all of that work in Ontario, but we do on occasion have to push some of that work out into other territories. And so we are also familiar with sort of how the visual effects tax credits work around the world. And sort of that's kind of my introduction. I'll, I think, turn it over to Matt next. Back to Matt.
Can I just add something, Matt, before
Sure.
you go on? That Nick made me remember or think about as an important point. It sort of elaborates on why OKs is unique. The other thing to keep in mind about Canadian system and Ontario in particular that is different than the rest of the world is that the Canadian incentives are available for people who do post only. And that's not the case around the world for a few reasons. One is because a number of jurisdictions have shooting threshold requirements. You have to shoot a certain percentage of principal photography in the jurisdiction to qualify for their incentive. A number of jurisdictions have a spend threshold that in some cases makes it prohibitive or impossible to apply for to qualify for post only. And then thirdly, just the facilities aren't available. So, you know, you may want to shoot in Colorado, but you can't do visual effects and post there. So that's important to keep in mind. There are a couple jurisdictions. There's one particular that has a post only credit, which is New York. And that's the only other one that has that opportunity. There are some other jurisdictions where the spend threshold is low enough, like Georgia, and there are some post and visual effects facilities, so they can compete, but there's a limited number that can do that. So that's important to keep in mind because Ontario, Quebec, and BC are not just attracting visual effects, but attracting post only. And so that sort of leads into what happened with the tethering. But that's an important point to keep in mind is that Canada is fairly unique in being able to attract post-only work.
Well, that's a perfect segue into some of the pros and cons of OCASE. Nick, if you could kick us off on some of your takes on the pros and cons as OCASE stands today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Matt. Look, I mean, pure and simple, very simple from the Take 5 standpoint is we want to continue to drive more work into the province. We want you know, Toronto has become a post and visual effects destination worldwide. Shows, as Len just mentioned, you know, we have that specialty in that we are able to bring post specifically to Toronto. It's not just shows that we work on. There are other studios now that are taking advantage of this. You know, Apple and Netflix will bring post-only shows. They'll shoot shows in New Zealand and bring some of their posts to Ontario. They'll shoot stuff in Ireland and bring some of their post and visual effects work to Ontario. So to continue to incentivize them to do so, you know, I think it's important that the producer overall takes that tax credit. You know, France and other jurisdictions around the world, you know, we've seen BC and Quebec's response to the original OCASE, you know, provide a better bonus, a better visual effects tax credit to the producers. You know, France has a 35% tax credit with bonuses if you spend over 2 million euros. Spain has a 30% tax credit. Australia, those are all sort of new visual effects jurisdictions that are starting to grow, and for us as a province to continue to be competitive, I think we need to make that change. I think it's important that it becomes a producer credit. At the end of the day, being a producer credit, I think that money will be reinvested in visual effects and in post work in the province. On most of our shows, you know, specifically with visual effects, we track two numbers when it comes to the overall budget. You know, the studios will give us a budget number that they're going to cash flow, and which we'll call sort of the gross number. And we will sort of, that's our kind of spending threshold on any given project. But then accompanied to that is a net number. Basically, the studio is going to cash flow X amount. They're going to get a tax credit back of Y amount. And then at the end of the day, the actual cost to them is going to be what that net cost of those tax credits is. And those are two numbers that not specifically in visual effects, we're constantly tracking so that sometimes we can take advantage of the opportunity that tax credits provide. You know, you can have a show that has a $40 million visual effects budget attached to it, and so you're always, sometimes that's never enough money, as we all know. Visual effects continues to grow through the course of a project, and so we're always looking at ways to maximize that budget, and in some cases leverage the tax credit. So what that means is we'll talk to the studio, convince the studio that, you know, if we can spend more money and if they can finance or they can cash flow more money, and we could add some additional tax credits to it, the net result of them is the same. And so we're trying to always look at ways to maximize the spend, to increase our spend so that we can, you know, give the showrunners and the creatives everything that they need. Over the past, you know, few years, and I think Len alluded to the fact that, you know, OCASE has evolved and changed from what it was originally meant to be. And so right now, you know, we also feel that there isn't really a standard. Each vendor interprets that tax credit very differently. You know, some vendors provide for a 10% discount, some an 8%, some 4%. I understand the fact that that the you know, no vendor is the same, and they all have different business models, and they all sort of run their businesses a little differently. But these inconsistencies in how the discount is applied just sort of makes, from a financing and an original finance plan standpoint, a little difficult. On top of that, I think that in some cases, and I don't want to generalize this, is that, you know, vendors are made whole by so as an example, you know, work is grossed up to then be discounted and netted down, which is back to what the original cost is. And so it sort of, in a way, isn't really sort of a tax credit. It is more of an overall discount that's being provided, that then we are further grinded down further on down the line when we apply for our overall tax credit. And so, you know, given all of these reasons, I think ultimately to increase, sort of drive more work, more visual effects work, more post-production work into the province, I think that we would all benefit from it being a producer tax credit.
Thanks, Nick. Paul, do you mind kind of bringing us all up to speed on the pros and cons as you see it?
Sure. Starting with the pros, again, I'm all for you know, producer-based credits and production credits to keep the province competitive with other jurisdictions. But again, the intention of OCASE at the beginning was to provide animation and visual effects companies financial assistance to offset the costs of maintaining up-to-date computer hardware and keeping software licenses current. In our history, the credit helped us bridge revenue gaps when project schedules were pushed, so help keep visual effects artists employed through unexpected slower times. And again, if there is a grind that takes place, I guess we'll get into that next after the cons. You know, I don't know what the big benefit is of it all being ground down at the end. I'd like to see our industry supported in terms of the vendors keeping up to date and current and competitive in the marketplace. I think moving on to the cons, I'm not sure, Nick, if you got a chance to say the cons there, but I'll start. Like in the past, even though projects met the criteria required for eligibility, the tethering to the OSPTC and the OFTTC applications really started to hinder the credits we received. So like we deal with a lot of mid-sized companies that just simply didn't bother applying for the production service tax credits. And so although we met all the requirements previously, suddenly a sizable amount of the anticipated credit was no longer qualified due to the tethering aspect. So that was a big con. Even like a big broadcast show for Bell Media, they just didn't apply for the credit, so it wasn't qualified. So it goes on for other larger production companies that did movies of the week. They, very heavy effects based shows. We expected that credit and provided rates accordingly, and then that credit was denied. So I think untethering is a big, or tethering is a big con for, or a big negative. Another negative, what it was the residency requirements, requiring artists to have paid taxes in Ontario the previous year. As we all know, the artists became very much in demand as Ontario's industry grew. And so a lot of new immigrants would be hired, but yet their costs were not able to be recouped in that first year. So that was also difficult. Then what came along was the producers asking for the OCASE credit, which we're talking about today. Dave, the BC credit, made allowances for producers on set. So Ontario did the same thing, providing an OCASE credit to producers for crediting their entire crew when they're shooting green screen or any visual effects plates. So that was sort of an attempt to balance out between the provinces. So it was one of the changes that came along. So now we had a studio OCASE credit as well as a producer credit for OCASE. Not all producers asked for discounts on our OCASE compensation. Sometimes they did, but others, we provided a discount, as Nick was saying. But the way I did it, I would try to bundle in the post-production services with any discount for OCASE. And so again, it became a benefit to the studio, or to our studio. So that's really it in a nutshell for me in terms of the pros and cons.
Thanks for that, Paul. That's great. Len, do you want to build on that before you dive into the budget breakdowns?
Yeah, I'll just, I can elaborate on a couple of things that both Nick and Paul said. Nick reminded me, in addition to New York, the other jurisdictions that have post-only credits are Australia and New Zealand. They have PDV offsets. They're actually very easy to qualify for, and they're in some cases better than their production benefits for offshore productions or foreign productions. Those are the other two jurisdictions that have specific credits. And just to elaborate on what Paul said, I kind of alluded initially to the fact that OCASE, the industry has changed, but the OCASE credit itself has changed quite a bit. And probably the first big one was allowing producers to claim the onset costs related to creating visual effects. That was not initially intended in the credit. It wasn't anticipated when they wrote the legislation. It's something that that OMDC and the Ministry of Finance together proposed as a way of competing with the Dave credit in BC within the existing regulations. So it was determined that the regulations were broad enough that producers could make that claim, but that's not the way the credit was written. So that, you can imagine, created kind of a problem. And then I think, and this is my interpretation of what's happened, the tethering was brought in a few years ago, as a result of two things. One is problems that the OMDC was seeing with the OID-MTC credit, that's the digital media credit, with different types of applications coming and having a difficulty proving that they were commercially exploitable products. And also with the change that was made at CASO on the federal credit to allow, on the federal content credit to allow digital distribution and streaming to qualify, which is something that Ontario hasn't followed suit yet. But that, I think, raised a point or made it clear to Ontario government officials that the types of productions that were claiming OCASE, there wasn't really a clear analysis of whether they were commercially exploitable, and that wasn't a specific enough test. And they wanted to create a better test, and so they tethered it to OPSTC, probably as the easiest way, well, OPSTC or OFTPC, as the easiest way to determine that a production was commercially exploitable. There was a production claiming OCASE was commercially exploitable. I think the point that people have been making now in these current government consultations is that that's not the best test. There are other ways that they can test whether something is commercially exploitable, but that's where I think where it came from. The government's never been really clear on why they've tethered. They've never said specifically, but in the current discussions we've had, I've been involved in through Film Ontario and CASO with Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Culture. It seems pretty clear to me that that's why they did it, was because they felt that productions were claiming OKs were not really meeting that test of commercially exploitable, and they needed something better to determine that.
Thanks, Len. I'm going to jump ahead to your budget breakdown if you want to walk everyone through that.
Yeah, so, I think it was important to look at the comparison. We mentioned some other jurisdictions outside of Canada that have visual effects credit or where producers can claim a bonus. So it's important, I think, to look at how Ontario stacks up with BC and Quebec, because those are the two biggest competitors for Ontario. There's obviously lots of other factors that people look at. Availability of crew, language is an issue in Quebec, the proximity of BC to Los Angeles makes a big difference. But just in terms of the numbers, and there's a lot of assumptions built into these calculations, which are that what qualifies would be the same. We know that's not true in Quebec versus Ontario and BC. Availability of crew, whether they've been resident for a long time, can be different in BC than Ontario. Both provinces have differences in terms of mobility of the crew, and the cost could be different. The cost of locations, or I think the crew rates are fairly similar, but cost of locations, equipment, lab services could be different. So that this assumes that everything is a level playing field. So that's assumption we have to make. But when you look at the calculations, that with principal, and these are only PSTC calculations, because that's really where on domestic content, producers don't look for other locations. Her producer can't produce in BC and get the BC content credit. So it's foreign producers that are looking at the different jurisdictions to locate their production. So when you compare BC and Ontario and Quebec on productions that shoot in Canada, Quebec is better than Ontario, but Ontario is better than BC. So that assumes that the BC production isn't getting a regional bonus, because regional bonus is available to BC foreign service productions. It's not available in Ontario, which would make BC better, or potentially equal, because there's up to 12% of BC production can get if they shoot regionally or distant. But on the principal photography, Quebec is better than Ontario. If you go to the next slide, we see the difference if only via visual effects is being done. And that is pretty clear that Ontario is third in that comparison, that Quebec is by far the better jurisdiction. One of the reasons for that, which is raised in one of the questions that was put forward, is the fact that Quebec allows producers to claim the visual effects bonus on all costs, not just labor costs, even though it's technically a labor bonus. That's one reason why Quebec is better, but also BC is better than Ontario just in terms of the visual effects work only. And then if you look at a production shooting in Canada without doing post, which is the next slide, you'll see that Ontario is actually the best in that scenario. So that is when production shoots in Ontario but doesn't do any visual effects or post, and that's where Ontario is the better jurisdiction of the three. And Quebec is pretty close, but Ontario is better. I think if you add in, so this, as I said, this assumed that all the costs are the same. Quebec, Ontario, as you may know, did not allow site fees or location fees to qualify. They've made that change recently. So if you took that out of this calculation, Ontario would be not as good as Quebec, but with those back in, that will make a big difference. And that's only made it much more competitive for Ontario. So I think that's where I just wanted to start with, looking at kind of the comparison with BC and Quebec in terms of where Ontario is right now in competing with those jurisdictions. And that's what producers are looking at when they're deciding on both where to shoot and where to do visual effects and post work. The other thing I wanted to present is a calculation of the grind and how it affects the bottom line of the costs. So as this is another change and not something that originally happened with OCASE. It's not that it wasn't in the legislation or had to be added to the legislation or regulations. This wasn't really contemplated, but it started to happen about probably 10 years ago, and it's become pretty common now. I think it happens all the time across the board on CRA audits, is that they will reduce the producer's qualified labor or qualified spend based on what the vendor is claiming or can claim for OCASE. So that is a deduction the producer gets when they're applying for OPSTC or OFTTC. And it doesn't, the producer may not, the problem with that is, the difficulty with that is that the producer may not know whether the vendor has claimed OCASE. They don't know what amount of OCASE the vendor is getting, but CRA will still make the deduction. And that can mean that even if the vendor doesn't claim OCASE, CRA will still make the deduction, because the way the regulation is written is that, or the definition of assistance is that assistance received or expected to be received will be deducted from the qualified cost. So expected to be received means that they still have the ability to apply for it. So when you do that deduction, it means the grind for the producer on their qualified spend for OPSTC or qualified labor for OFTTC includes the amount of OCASE that the vendor is getting. What it means is when you, so that's kind of one thing I wanted to point out. The second thing is to compare whether the producer is better off, because we're looking at sort of what the producer's perspective is on bringing work to Ontario versus BC or Quebec, and how they calculate the OCASE. When the producer looks at whether the vendor discounts their fee by the OCASE they're getting or invoices the full amount, it actually shows, and I was kind of surprised by this, that it's better for the producer to have the vendor discount their fee based on their OCASE amount than not to. Although the producer gets more tax credit if they don't discount their fee. So even though they're better off if the vendor does discount their fee based on the OCASE amount, the perception of the producer will often be that they're better off if the vendor doesn't discount their fee. And that's because, one, they get more tax credit if they don't, and two, they don't really know whether the discount has been the full amount of the OCASE or not. And so from the producer's perspective, they would prefer, I would assume they prefer that vendors don't discount their fee. So that's just another comparison we wanted to look at. I think we can move on to, I think it's the questions next.
Yeah, thanks. That was great.
How would you improve?
So Nick, I wonder if you can kick us off and just kind of discuss, how you think kind of is the best way to improve the OCASE tax credit.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Matt. I mean, as said, previously, like I think we want to continue to drive more business into Ontario. We want our vendors to continue to grow, and by having it as a producer credit will allow us to do that. Right now there's a lot of jobs or sort of positions that actually don't qualify for the OCASE tax credit. Anything that's administrative in nature, a visual effects producer, a visual effects coordinator, supervisor, production manager, only a portion of their fees qualify for the OCASE. Otherwise, they don't. We'd love to see something that encapsulates all of the visual effects spend, and so not sort of that we kind of have this constant sort of grind down and sort of our overall spend is this, and then it's a percentage of this and a percentage of that determines what that tax credit is. I think in other jurisdictions around the world and within Canada, it's an easier calculation, and therefore from a sellability standpoint to the rest of the world, it just makes it much easier for them to calculate and to continue to push more work into Ontario.
Awesome. Thanks, Nick. Paul, over to you.
All right. Well, I'm learning a lot today as well about the grinding. Obviously, I think the way to improve OCASE tax credit is to remove the grind that goes to the producer for the vendor-based tax credit, because then it would even things out. It would allow the studios to receive the intention of OCASE at the onset of CASO. Other ways to improve OCASE would be to remove that residency criteria, like I mentioned before, and also just make the communication clear to producers. I think it's become overly complicated, and I think if they understood that they still get an OCASE credit for the on-set work that they do, for their entire crew to be covered when they're shooting green screen and visual effects plates, that is an OCASE credit, right? So that would, I think, solve it all.
Thanks for that, Paul. Len, do you want to build on that?
I just think those are all good points. I think Paul's points are really good suggestions. I just want to, and I don't mean to be a wet blanket, but one of the things I heard a lot when both when I was at the ONDC, but also as a CASO and Film Ontario talking to the Ministry of Culture or Ministry of Finance, is that they really don't like technical fixes. And those are technical fixes. So the one, what I would suggest, the best, I think there's an opportunity here. The government has heard really clearly that the industry doesn't like tethering. No one likes it. Vendors don't like it. Producers don't like it. And there's an opportunity to fix OCASE. And I think if we fix it as an overhaul of, if it's pitched as an overhaul of the OCASE credit, a lot of those things could be wrapped up into that. But I think the residency issue is a really good one. I think there's a strong argument for that. I think the grind on the producer's claim that is a possibility, because there are other credits. There are other examples of both credits and equity financing from government that are specifically excluded from the grind. And so OCASE could be written into that. That could be written into the OCASE credit. So those are all good suggestions.
If I could,
that, Len.
Quick,
Yes, go ahead.
I just sort of speak to the idea of eligibility, sort of from artists that are outside or that sort of have to be residents of Ontario. That wouldn't just affect OCASE; that would affect everything. So OPSTC. So if only a certain portion of that work that's being done in Ontario is not being done by Ontario residents, then it has an overall effect. So yeah, would love to see that included. But what happens if so much of that gets done offshore, and so the government, then there's less and less of that work that's been done in Ontario.
There's two parts of that. One is the work being rendered in Ontario or performed in Ontario, and the other is by Ontario residents. So that's one distinction to make sure we are clear on. And the second is that the residency requirement can be different in different credits. So Ontario has so far followed the same residency requirement for each credit, but other provinces have different residency requirements. So right now, federally, a person has to be resident the year in which the work is done for the PSTC credit. And Ontario has to be resident the year before principal photography started. So already Ontario is different from the federal credit on what the residency requirement is, and that has to be administered by CRA. So it is possible to say that there's an argument for OCASE that the residency requirement should be different. I don't think there's any possibility of Ontario agreeing to work being done outside the province for OCASE, but you can still make the requirement that the work is performed in Ontario, but the residency requirement is different. And they're not going to, if people aren't paying taxes on that income, they're not going to allow it. But you can still be paying taxes on work performed in Ontario and not have to be resident the year before. So there is an opportunity there. I think that's a case that's a case that has to be made to the government, but there's a possibility.
Thanks for that, Len. We do want to leave some time for member questions. Paul, in 2 minutes or less, can you maybe discuss kind of what you think is the best and the worst things about OCASE becoming a producer-based tax credit?
Well, I think we still have to do a lot of paperwork as a vendor to justify the credit that would have been received, and so there is no real benefit now to doing all that paperwork and tracking, apart from making the producer happy. So if it's going directly to the producer, I think some kind of flat would be better, or actually making that grind go away would be better than having OCASE stop being a vendor credit. I don't know if I answered the question properly, Matt, but that was what came to mind.
That's great, Paul.
Yeah.
And actually, Nick, I might throw it to you just to keep things moving. So
yeah, I mean, just quite simply, wouldn't vendors just want to take the full cost of the work that they're doing up front? I mean, to Paul's point, there's a lot of sort of paperwork that needs to be done. There's a lot of cash flowing or financing of that you're going to have to, that you currently do, because you're not going to get that tax credit into 12, 18 months afterwards. So how about getting that money right up front? It costs, the shot cost is X, it's paid at X, you've got your money, you don't have to worry about it, other than making sure that you're qualifying for the residency part of it and the work being done in Ontario part of it.
Excellent. Len, do you want to have a few words on pros and cons of the switch?
So I think the worst that could happen is not the status quo. I think the status quo would not be the worst. The worst would be that they get rid of a visual effects bonus completely. So I don't think it's going to happen, but the worst would be if the government said, this is all too complicated and we're hearing different messages, we're just going to get rid of it. That would be the worst. The best is not, I don't know what the best scenario is, but the best thing that could happen is that more work is brought to Ontario. That's the best thing, is the result, not the change. So there could be various scenarios that do that, but I think that's going to be the best thing we can hope, is that there's more work in Ontario as a result of whatever happens.
I think we all agree with that. Thank you, everyone, for sending in some member questions in advance. It was incredibly helpful. We'll walk through them to the best we can. If the OCASE grinds against the labor tax credit so no one can triple dip, what is the benefit of the producer getting this tax credit? Len, I'll pass that over to you.
Yeah, so there are benefits, it's specifically from the producer's perspective, and there's a few. One is timing, because everyone knows the way OCASE works now. You have to apply for OCASE after the work is done, so based on a fiscal year of actual cost, which is different than OPSTC and OPTC applications. So, and there's a delay in getting the OCASE credit. So making it a producer bonus on the OPSTC or OPTC would eliminate that double system and reduce the timing of getting the OCASE amount back. Transparency is another benefit for producers, because there's always some question about whether they're getting the right information from the vendor, whether they really know what the credit is worth, whether they're getting the benefit of it. There's a cost of time and also of application fees to do separate applications. So right now, even though the vendor is applying for the OCASE for their part, the producer has to apply for, if they shoot in Ontario, the OCASE for the onset cost. So there's an additional application fee, an additional application that has to be filled out. So those things would be eliminated. So from the producer's perspective, even though they would still have a grind, there's still some benefits to it.
Thanks for that, Len. The next question is, if Ontario chooses to change OCASE to a producer-based tax credit, how will it be administered to correct this basic inequity in the way tax credit applications are processed between provinces, and how will vendor labor eligibility be ensured if there's no audit review by the CRA?
So this is a complicated question. So it assumes that, that everyone follows the regulations and audits the same, and that's not the case. So I mentioned earlier that Quebec allows non-labor costs to qualify for the visual effects bonus, which is not in the regulation. It's something that they've decided. In fact, in a bad translation from French to English, they call it a broad-based definition of labor, which I don't know what that means, but it means that they don't follow the regulation. So that is risky, because I think it's risky because they're basically allowing costs that qualify that aren't actually protected in the regulation, and they could change their mind on that at any time. That's not something I would suggest Ontario would do, but that is what Quebec is doing. So it's hard to compete with someone who's doing something that's not actually in the regulation. So that's the first part. The second part is their audit requirements are the same across the country, even though Revenue Quebec audits separately on the Quebec credit. They have the same ability to audit. They can look at the same things. They don't apply those the same. This is an argument that we have at Global Incentives with CRA. Producers have, studios have, everyone has this problem. CRA does not apply the audit. They do not audit the same across the country. They audit differently in BC than they do in Ontario. They audit differently in Atlantic Canada, and that's not supposed to be the case. They're supposed to be consistent across the country. We've been saying that from day one with CRA, and making that complaint. It gets addressed somewhat, but there's nothing we can do really to enforce it. So no, we can't make sure that that there is equity across the provinces if any changes are made. I think we still have to look at the best way we can change Outcase to make it more competitive and to make it easier for producers and vendors to claim it. But we can't make sure, there's no way to make sure that it's they're administered equitably.
Thanks for that breakdown, Len. On which province or country's tax credit system has CASO based its producer bonus model for Outcase? Is there an ideal? This is a question that I can answer. So just so our membership is 100% aware, this is not a CASO initiative at all. CASO sole initiative is to untether the tax credit. We lobbied on behalf of untethering the tax credits. We met with politicians and decision makers on untethering the tax credit. This is not a CASO agenda. We're simply bringing back the information that we're hearing from our collective meetings and also our partnership meetings with the other bodies. And we think it's important to have an open discussion. So everything on this behalf is not on CASO. We're just trying to create a healthy, informed debate. So hopefully that answers the question.
I can elaborate on that too. I think the other thing to remember is, the producer model, producer-based bonus model has been out there since Creative BC, or BC introduced the date credit, and Quebec followed right after. So that model's always been out there as a comparison. The current, as I said at the beginning, the current discussions were not initiated by a suggestion of a producer bonus. It was based on fixing the untethering. Film Ontario, as far as I know, Ontario Creates, no one right now is proposing a producer bonus as the #1 priority or the ultimate fix. I think Film Ontario's submission suggested that is one option, but only if, and they were pretty clear on this, only if it meant that vendors were there's no unintended consequences that would disadvantage vendors. That if it was made into a producer bonus, Ontario had to do something else to help the vendors, that the Ontario visual effects vendors, because the business model, the current industry situation that exists in Ontario is fairly unique, and it has brought a lot of benefits, and they want to make sure that Film Ontario wants to make sure that the Ontario government is continuing to support that. So yeah, that's the other part, is that this did not start as the producer bonus. It started somewhere else.
Thanks for that, Len. How would CASO's proposed producer bonus model work in situations where the producer, copyright holder, is an American company engaging an Ontario studio to perform animation, special effects work? Who would take care of the Outcase administration, and what eligibility requirements would that non-Canadian producer copyright holder need to meet to be eligible for Outcase? Len, I'll pass it to you again, just to get it reiterated, it's not a CASO proposal.
Yeah, it's not a CASO proposal. This is similar to the other question about how making sure that it's equitable across the provinces. So basically, the way a producer bonus would work is that, and the way it works in BC and Quebec, is that if visual effects work is done in the province, and the producer is paying a vendor, they get an additional amount of tax credit. So in BC, it goes from 28 to 44%. In Quebec, it goes from 20 to 36%. And it just changes the rate. So it doesn't actually change anything else in the system. They don't have to apply separately. It's all part of the application. There's really no other tests. The same audit requirements apply that would apply to any other costs that they're claiming under the regular credits. So it really doesn't, the requirement about who's contracting with the copyright holder is all the same. So basically, if the production qualifies in Ontario qualifies for the OPSDC credit, And it just means that the cost that they pay to a visual effects vendor would get, instead of getting, say, like if they just added it up together, getting 21.5%, they'd get 39.5% on those costs. That's all it would mean.
Thanks for that, Len. To what extent has CASO considered advocating for a hybrid OCASE, where either the service provider or the producer copyright holder would be eligible to apply for OCASE? Just so everyone's aware, at CASO, what we have gone back to the government with is that if there is change at hand, we would love to put together a subcommittee where we would discuss everything from a hybrid approach to, what potentially would be the other avenues to take. I think it's a really intriguing situation. But the current goal would be, if there is, again, we're lobbying heavy on untethering, we're pushing for untethering, hopefully that will happen. And then, but if there is a larger change, our goal is to be an effective partner. I'm sure there was a lot of people that were blindsided by the reduction down to 18%. And the goal of CASO and the collective board members is to make sure that if there is a change, that the CASO membership is included in that change, so it's not a broadside hit. So that is our current approach, but I think there's a lot to unpack there. Len, can you speak to any other jurisdiction where this would be applicable?
There's certainly other jurisdictions to support various industry sectors, and visual effects and animation is one of those that I think across the world is looked at as a growth industry. So there's other kinds of government support. There isn't really a jurisdiction that has a production-based tax credit that's a rebate on spend that goes to a vendor. So Ontario is fairly unique in that situation. But I think, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that, and as Paul mentioned, that this credit initially was designed to build the visual effects vendor base in Ontario, and it's done that really effectively. And I think Ontario knows that, and they want to continue that. I don't think they want to abandon that strategy. But I think Ontario is also looking at how to compete with other jurisdictions to attract business to Ontario. So a hybrid model is certainly a possibility. It's not where the government started. I don't know whether it's feasible, but it's certainly one thing that they could be considering as a way of both continuing to attract foreign productions by making Ontario look more competitive and making the credit more transparent and simpler to understand, because that's one of the big hurdles, but also continuing to support the visual effects vendors in Ontario.
Thank you for that, Len. We're going to get everyone out directly at 11 o'clock. There are 3 questions that popped up in the forum. Jeremy had a question for Nick regarding the administration individuals and not being applicable for tax credits. Can anyone speak to why they think that is the case? They don't want to be perceived as being too generous, I think was the question. But Len, in other jurisdictions, are administration individuals in VFX and animation applicable for tax credits? Obviously in Quebec, yes, but what about BC?
So yes, because in BC, yes, generally they are. This is an example of jurisdictions implementing the regulations differently. So the regulation in BC, Quebec aside, because they do an all spend on the visual effects, so they're not separating any costs out. BC does have the same kind of definition for onset, but they allow more people. So their interpretation of who's involved in creating a visual effect is different than what Ontario does. On the Dave bonus for post, because it's not visual effects specific, it actually was extended. It was created as a visual effects bonus and they extended it to all post costs. So because they allow it on all post costs, they don't discount any positions from what qualifies for the bonus. And because it's a producer bonus, it's what the producer pays to the visual effects vendor. So it's partly a different definition or implementation of the regulation, and partly it's because of the way the credit is structured, because it's a producer bonus and it includes all post, so they don't have to carve out certain positions.
Thanks for that, Len. All right, we're just about to hit 11 o'clock. I want to massively thank Len, Paul, and Nick for their time today and time in preparation for this. So thank you very much for that on behalf of CASO. I also want to thank all of you for attending. If there are any additional questions that you have, please feel free to reach out to Anne, and we'll kind of put together and try to answer some of those in the monthly mail outs that we send along. So most importantly, everyone take care of yourself, take care of each other, and try to have yourself an amazing summer. All the best.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Bye.